Hello everyone and welcome to our next lecture on language change and its principles, and I'll also be doing a brief overview of chapter 1, which by now you should have read. Okay, so let's begin. Language change is considered, it's constant, and it applies to all languages, not just English. So it's important that we understand it before we tackle the centuries-long evolution of English. Okay, let's start with the general perception of language change. There are three typical attitudes displayed towards language change by linguists and the public. The first is that language change can be seen as a slow deterioration from a perfect state. The second is that language change can be seen as a slow evolution toward a more efficient state. The third is that language change can be seen as neither progress or decay, but simply change. Those in the first group who lament language change as decay have a number of reasons. One, people might feel a sense of nostalgia or rightness about the earlier form of language. It might be the quote-unquote good old days argument for why things shouldn't change. There may be a concern for linguistic purity. In other words, we're doing things the way we do for a reason, and if we change, the system deteriorates. There may be some social class prejudice involved. Those who fear language change may worry that younger generations or people who don't have the same education level are changing vocabulary and grammar just willy-nilly. Some people highly believe that inflected languages like Latin and Greek were perfect, and the further we stray away from Latin and Greek, the worse off our language is. And finally, it may be some misguided admiration for the written form and failure to recognize that the spoken and written word are not exact duplicates of one another. Either way, in this course, for us, we're going to be taking this third approach, right? Change isn't necessarily good or bad. It just is. So let's study some of those effects. Okay, so now what I want to do is put into perspective language change. Okay? This is what I want you to remember. Even the idealized Latin of Cicero or the French of Voltaire is the culmination of language change. So as much as we want to idealize Latin and early French, what we're idealizing is language that went through a change. Okay, language is constantly in flux, and we don't notice how great some of these changes are because we're in a moment. The change from Old English to present day English in comparison is going to seem monumental. Okay, there's no such thing as uniformity within a given language either. Change is gradual and generally not noticeable. And finally, separations in language communities has two major results. And by language communities, I just mean kind of place. Two results, okay? One, different languages, right? We're in different places. Our language is going to change and become different. Two, dialects, or different ways of pronouncing and using the same language. And we're going to talk about dialects later. Let's look at a shift then to show what we're talking about. The first historical language change we'll discuss is the Germanic sound shift, or the first sound shift. This was an unconditioned change in Germanic languages. Unconditioned means that it affected all relevant sounds without exception. So, Jacob Grimm of the Brothers Grimm published his observations about the Germanic sound shift in a German grammar book. Okay? And he did this in 1828. And he was building on the work of Danish scholar Rasmus Rask, who in 1818 observed that something significant happened in the pronunciation of German languages, and this shift is what we're going to be looking at. Okay, so what Grimm noticed is that the sound shift must have happened after Germanic languages separated from other Indo-European branches, but before the German group was split into North, West, and East German. So this change must have happened sometime between 1000 and 400 BCE. Okay, now the causes of this shift are unknown, and some of the proposed causes are silly, right? Like some people believe that the change happened because the change of the atmosphere in crossing the mountainous terrain. No. But according to Grimm, he claimed that the change was due to the violent progress and craving for freedom of the Germanic people. Also, no. The sound change itself is explained in what we today call Grimm's law. This law posits that a massive unconditioned sound change affected all stop consonants of Germanic languages. And a stop consonant are letters like T, D, K, G, and P. And that's when the airflow stops in the production of the sound. Okay, so all of these letters shifted to a different pronunciation and representative letter. Okay, here's an example. According to Grimm, a P in Indo-European was changed to F in Germanic languages. So that's how we go from the Latin Pisces to the modern fish, right? Those language changes is also how we went from the Latin tres to the modern three. It's these kinds of shifts that get us to where we are today. These changes in Grimm's explanatory rules account for the correspondences between certain consonants in Germanic languages with those in Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin. However, as always, sometimes the consonant correspondence didn't function according to the rules. Grimm knew this, but he couldn't explain it. Enter Verner's law. Verner's law comes from Carl Verner, a Danish scholar who explains the exceptions to Grimm's law. Okay, he does this about 50 years after Grimm's publication. Verner was finally able to explain why some letters didn't switch according to Grimm's law. He discovered that when the Indo-European accent, right, so how they're speaking, was not on the vowel immediately preceding the stop consonant, so the T, D, K, G, and P, or the letter that should change, then Grimm's law would not apply. Okay? Essentially, Verner observed that lack of stress is associated with voicing, or the way vocal cords move to make sounds. Okay, so that was a lot, and that's confusing, but it's just kind of a basic idea of where we're going. Okay? What I want to do is briefly kind of flip through chapter 1. Okay? Alright, so let's begin there. So, chapter 1 is kind of an introduction to English. Okay? One of the first things it does in the chapter is it asks, why English? And here are some of the points that I've pulled out. First, the most remarkable thing about English today is that it is used as an additional language by more than 370 million people around the globe. That means approximately a third of the world's population know or think they know some English. And something that I want you to kind of highlight that I took from the book comes from page 2. Right? It says, the reason is not that the language is easy, beautiful, or superior in linguistic qualities. Most people want to learn it because they need it to function in the world at large. So this is how I summed it up. English isn't pretty, but it's useful. The chapter moves on and it talks a little bit about the concentric circles that English is spoken in. And this is an image hopefully you've seen already. I know I put it in the media folder for this week, and I think I had it in the media folder for last week. So it's this idea that there are 3 circles of English. In the inner circle, that represents the handful of countries where most of the inhabitants speak English as a first language. The outer circle here, that includes a large number of countries where English is a second, often official or semi-official language, but where most users of the language are not native speakers. And then we have this larger expanding circle where English is learned and used as a foreign language. And this circle includes pretty much every country in the world. The chapter then moves on to ask this murky question of, do we need English, or why? And I say murky because there are those who are going to be like, are going to question whether or not this steps on their linguistic toes. Remember our earlier discussion with people who see language as deteriorating? Well, if we make English global, something's going to have to change to make it more accessible. And what do you think their thoughts then are going to be on that global language? Right? So a little murky. I get why they asked the question, but it's a little iffy. The text then moves on to explain why English. Okay? And to reiterate what I said early, it's not pretty, but it is functional. Okay? Also, English takes just as long to learn. Now I'm on page 6, and I'm reading this section called Why English, and it says, a comprehensive grammar of English is definitely no shorter than, say, a grammar of French or German. Okay, so we're not cutting any corners here. The other reason for English as kind of a global language, vocabulary. Okay, the word stock for English is vast. The most comprehensive dictionary of the English language, the Oxford English Dictionary, defines a total of over 600,000 word forms. That's 500,000 words. Okay? The English language is vast. Historically, English spread because of things like the British Empire. In the late 19th century, the British Empire was doing what British empires did in the late 19th century, and it covered a considerable part of the Earth's land surface. Okay? And of course, the language spoken then, English. The same thing in the 20th century with America. The United States of America was the leading economic, military, and scientific power of the 20th century. And the language of choice? English. Modern technology, right? Innovations such as the telephone, radio, television, jetliner transport, computers, all of that meant that English could spread wider and faster. And finally, whenever you're in countries or groups of countries where people have several or many different first languages, English is the preferred lingua franca, or language of choice. It's felt sometimes to be a neutral ground. Okay, so what's next for us is we're going to jump right into English as it developed in the British Isles and later in territories conquered. I know we covered a lot. I know that you're anxious. Don't be anxious. I just want you to kind of get an idea of how language changed, why it changed, and why English. We'll be discussing another language shift later, the Great Vowel Shift, but Again, I don't want you to be kind of overwhelmed. As always, if you have any questions, please, please, please feel free to contact me. Have a great, great day.